In the summer of 1955, a young 14-year-old boy by the name of Ehimetalor traveled south from Chicago to visit his family in rural Mississippi. Upon arriving, he was hanging out with his cousins one day and went into a local grocery store. At that grocery store, he would have a chance encounter with a woman that would change the course of American history. That woman's name was Carolyn Bryant. Ms. Bryant was the owner of that grocery store. On that day, she would allege that young Ehimetalor whistled at her. She would also allege that he physically and verbally advanced towards her. She would soon tell her husband what allegedly had taken place, and her husband was outraged. Within days after this alleged incident, her husband and his brother went to the home of the uncle of Ehimetalor and kidnapped young Emmett. They kidnapped him and would proceed to beat his body, mutilate his body, and eventually shoot him in the head. His body was disposed of in the Tallahatchie River, and 3 days after he was murdered, his body was recovered by law enforcement when it resurfaced. Upon finding his body, it was sent back home to Chicago to be funeralized. And when his body arrived, his mother, seeing his body in the condition that it was, had to make a decision about what she was going to do as far as his funeral was concerned. She made the gut-wrenching decision to have an open casket funeral for her son, her baby boy. She wanted the world to see what had been done to her son while he was in Mississippi. Needless to say, the world was shocked and outraged when they saw the images that came out of that funeral. Those images ultimately led to what we know now today as the civil rights movement of the 1950s and the 1960s. It was almost a decade later, in 1964, that President Lyndon B. Johnson would sign into law the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which banned discrimination against people based on their race, color, religion, and sexual orientation. So it begs the question that if the law, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, was put into place all the way back then why, on May 25th of 2020, did George Floyd have his life taken by a white police officer in Minneapolis, Minnesota? George Floyd laid on the pavement, face down, with this officer's knee on his neck for nearly 9 minutes. He kept saying he couldn't breathe. He couldn't breathe. Now, the reality is this. The reason why George Floyd was murdered by that officer was because legislation, laws, cannot get rid of discrimination. The reality is that in order to get rid of discrimination, we have to get to the root of the issue. The root of that issue is a heart issue. We have to be able to see citizens that don't look like us, that may not sound like us, may not come from the same area of the country. We have to see them as our equals. We have an obligation as community members to stand up and to do the right thing. The biggest thing that we can do as community members is to have tough conversations, conversations that we haven't had as a country up to this point. And so we must lead the charge, all of us, community activists, faith leaders, politicians. We must all do our part to make sure that discrimination goes by the wayside. There are 3 things that we should do in order to deal with the problems that we're facing within this country. The first thing we have to do is we have to be educated. We have to know, we have to look at what are the issues that we are facing in this country from a historical standpoint. The next thing that we must do is we must organize. We have to organize and put a plan into place in order for it to be effective. And last, but certainly not least, we must execute that plan. We must take action, because if we do not take action, then the plan that we put forth will not be as good as the paper that it's written on. I want to close with a quote from Coretta Scott King. And that quote says this: "The struggle is a never-ending process. Freedom is never really won. You have to earn freedom each and every generation. So let's win today by getting the freedom for this generation."